You're listening to the Packernet Podcast Network.
We all have smartphones, and we all know they're pretty amazing, but they also can be amazingly distracting, especially when we're around other people. So US Cellular wants us to reset our relationship with our phones by putting down our phones for $5. That's right, a company that sells phones wants us to put down our phones. And to see what we find, learn more at uscellular.com/built for us.
We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end...
What will I become?
Senua's Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome once again to the Packernet Podcast. I am your host and resident panelist, as always, Ryan Schlipp. Check us out online, packernet.com. Find me on Twitter, pack_daddy. Well, it's been, I feel like we've attacked it from every which way, but, well, we maybe found something else. Mr. Numberman sent me an article from Arif Hasan. It's on one of these Substack behind the paywall things, but he was nice enough to shoot me the whole article. Arif Hasan, if I'm not mistaken, is a Vikings fan, so we should keep that in the backs of our minds. But he expresses some skepticism about Jordan Love and his ability to maintain what he was doing. It's kind of in line with what we've been talking about in terms of the Packers' ascension, and will that continue? Of course, we can't actually officially answer the question. We don't know. Crazy stuff happens. But it's worth exploring. I mean, it is the most important question for the Packers right now. I mean, it ties in with giving him a contract. How much should we give him a contract, which some people are asking. I doubt very many Packer fans are asking that question, but it is being asked. But, I mean, the trajectory of the Packers, the NFC North, the NFL kind of rests on this one question. I mean, if Jordan Love continues what he was doing, the Packers will continue to be a top team, and that's, regardless of Jared Goff and the Lions and whether they continue to ascend or continue to decline, regardless of Caleb Williams, regardless of J.J. McCarthy, the Packers will always be in contention. It'll be like what we heard every year with Aaron Rodgers in terms of as long as you got Rodgers, you got a chance to be blah, 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 blah. And so I figured I'd go through some of his the points that he makes here. I don't know that a ton of it is anything that we didn't hear before, but some of it just kind of annoyed me, and I think because I know he's a Vikings fan, it especially annoyed me. So I wanted to go through it. And then I feel like I've done this before, but I know I didn't. I wanted to pull up, I went back through all of PFF history. I pulled up every single quarterback with an 80 PFF grade or higher that maybe wouldn't be considered a premier player. Like, we don't need to analyze Aaron Rodgers, because the question is how many times do guys do what Jordan did and then don't do it, continue what they've been doing. I know we did this to some degree, but I want to go back and look at every single quarterback and just see. Right, so that would be sort of a secondary question. Aside from all the metrics and data that Mr. Arif Hasan is going to bring to us, there is obviously a level of uncertainty. But then again, one of the things that gives me the most confidence is just how many people that are not good quarterbacks are able to do what Jordan Love did is really the question. And that doesn't mean that even if you can't find anybody that Jordan couldn't be the first, but it's still worth noting, right? So anyways, why don't we start poking through this a little bit? He mentioned he was on an episode of the Purple Insider podcast, obviously a Vikings podcast. He joins Matthew Collier to rank teams by 2-year window, a way of putting the Vikings' decision to draft and develop a quarterback in better context, blah, blah, blah. In that appearance, I expressed skepticism about Jordan Love's trajectory with reference to issues regarding his season-long splits, style of play, and sample size. He goes on to say the Packers are steeped in uncertainty, which I think is not entirely true. In addition to the prospect of Love regressing after an impressive late season run into the playoffs, the Packers have hired a new defensive coordinator and have an offensive line in a state of flux. So, steeped in uncertainty, I don't know about that necessarily. I mean, if you mean uncertainty from the standpoint of it's hard to gauge what they're going to be, I guess that's fine. But steeped in uncertainty from a standpoint of the Packers, being uncertain about this, that, or the other in somewhat of a negative way, like do we have a quarterback and that kind of stuff, I don't think so. Because first of all, again, the idea that Love is going to regress, although possible, I don't think that's really on the Packers' radar. They're going to give the guy a contract that is reflective of what he did last year because of their confidence in what he did. They hired a new defensive coordinator. That's true. Again, maybe I'm being defensive and it wasn't meant in a negative way, but when you had one of the worst defenses in football, it doesn't really matter what happens with the new defensive coordinator because you can't really get any worse. And an offensive line in a state of flux is an exaggeration. David Bakhtiari is irrelevant to the conversation. The only real flux here is that we lost John Runyon, who was really struggled last year, and we brought in a new left tackle who we drafted in the first round. That's the only real flux, and that's pretty low-level fluctuation there. He goes on to say, it's not just an idle question for fans. Love's contract voids after the 2024 season, and the Packers will have to make a decision about whether they want to extend him now and potentially save some money or allow him to show out and command a tremendous market price. I've already talked about this. I don't see that unless I'm way off and the Packers are going to offer him like $40 million, and maybe that's where we're at. Maybe that's what the Packers are saying. Like, you just haven't put together enough for me to, for us to give you a top end contract. But again, if we're talking 48, him showing out for the year, it's not going to go up that much. Not in a way that's going to damage the Green Bay Packers. They would happily pay top of market if they knew he was the guy. But again, I think there's this projection being put on the Packers of the Green Bay Packers really not knowing and really not being sure and kind of being nervous about this and like, well, do we lock him up now for dirt cheap because he didn't prove anything, or do we make him play another year, improve it, and then we have to pay him top of market money? And it's like, I don't think that that's the situation we're in. I just don't. I think the Packers are going to reach an agreement with Jordan Love. I think both parties want to get this done. I think he's going to be paid a lot more than what Arif Hasan here is alluding to. And I'm sure that's going to reach a bunch of blowback from oh my, you paid him that? Oh, you idiot. Because again, they're seeing him as just this like, well, yeah, he had a couple good games, like whoop-de-doo, who cares? And I don't see that as the situation we're in. Nevertheless, those prospects have propelled the Packers to second-place odds in the NFC North with a win total estimate of 9.5 in most sports books, with unfavorable odds for the over. One sportsbook even has them at 10.5. And again, just sort of the general shock. I don't know if he's aware of this, but 9.5 wins is not a ton. It's not a massive heap of respect. So, I mean, you can just feel the very different perspective coming from Hasan, just in this sort of, like, despite all these massive questions, the sportsbooks still have him at 9.5, one even at 10.5. Like, okay. I mean, they were pretty awful an entire half of a season and came back and reached that level and got into the playoffs and all that. But yeah, I mean, I guess it's maybe shocking. It says, but how good is Jordan Love and can we tell? So he starts off talking about a thing called sustainable metrics, which is good to go through anyways. He says there are a number of statistics we can use to help us cut through the noise. Many of them I outlined in my piece on J.J. McCarthy, which details the difference between highly impactful production statistics and sustainable metrics that predict future performance. So I'm not going to go back and do the homework to double check his work. I'm guessing this is somewhat established in terms of, I talk about a lot of this kind of stuff in terms of what I guess I casually refer to as fleeting statistics, which are things that you can't really rely on. Like when a corner dominates in the NFL because he had 10 interceptions. Very unlikely he's going to replicate that. It's not a sustainable metric. So obviously when he talks about sustainable metrics, he's talking about metrics that tend to carry from season to season. He says there's a lot of ways to break down the statistical production of a quarterback, but it's important to separate the kinds of production that project well to future success and the kinds of production that can operate as red herrings. A very good example of this is third down success rate. McCarthy is statistically the best quarterback in the class at converting third and long through the air. All of the available evidence suggests to us that this rarely translates season to season, or especially from one level to the next. He says, unfortunately, many of the most unstable metrics that we have access to are the most exciting, which is part of the reason why I think I argue with so many people all the time, because we're just speaking two different languages. Everybody else wants to talk about the basic statistics, which most people know, touchdowns and yards, and also the fantasy football kind of statistics. He says, in essence, we're looking at half-court shots these quarterbacks are taking and assuming they'll translate. It's explosive, impactful, and fun, but it doesn't tell us very much about their eventual success in the NFL. In short, being good at volatile metrics isn't a bad thing, but it can trick the viewer. For the Packers and the rest of the NFC North, the question is whether or not Love falls into the category of quarterbacks where his highlights can mislead viewers into thinking he's a higher quality quarterback than he is. So from there, he goes to highlight some of the different metrics. We heard a lot about this at the beginning of the season, right? The what was it, EPA and CPOE, largely because Jordan Love was such a massive anomaly. Never was, I wasn't able to go back and find a single quarterback. Never really have we seen a guy who is so terrible in CPOE, which is completion percentage over expected, I think, and EPA. He was awful in CPOE and elite in EPA. So it was very confusing. So he goes on to talk about Love didn't really do very good in stable metrics. Success rate refers to percentage of plays where a player earns 0 or better EPA. Talks about CPOE. RBSDM CPOE measures, looks at depth of target and general direction. Talks about next-gen stats, also has that. Essentially saying that Jordan Love is artificially appealing, right? He gives you all the flashy stuff, but not necessarily the important stuff. But then he gets into the main part of this whole situation. The next part says, season splits, a love story. And that's where, if you look at, again, the first half was terrible. And this is the thing, like, he's saying things that I think we all know. Like, it's like this big cautionary tale. Watch out for Jordan Love. I don't know if you knew this. He was pretty bad at the beginning of the year. He was pretty bad if you look at the metrics over the full course of the year. Like, yeah, dude. We know because of the first half of the year. It's got nothing to do with the second half of the year. That's the whole point. He says, in the first half of the season, Love played poorly and was rewarded with average level output. Did that happen in the second half of the season? And then the first thing they show is that same chart, which has EPA and CPOE, which is from weeks 10 through 18. Jordan Love might be the highest on this chart. It's always kind of hard to tell. It's not an exact science, but I mean, he is arguably the top quarterback here. Says, through the second half of the season, Love was the second most efficient quarterback by EPA per play and fourth by CPOE. By the composite CPOE and EPA metrics that RBSDM uses, Love finished second overall. Was he better at more stable statistics we pay attention to? Well, CPOE is one of those statistics, and he was bonkers at that. What else? He ranked third in adjusted net yards per attempt, second in success rate, and second in PFF grade. Love produced high-level results using what looks like high-level process. The change is remarkable. He dialed down some of the tight window throws, limited his turnover production, and took on more checkdowns. That certainly seemed like a quarterback that has learned some lessons about how to more ideally play the position, and that could be a reason the division is doomed to see another star quarterback lead the Packers. But is it reasonable to use a half sample of games to really look at quarterback development? Who is real Jordan Love? Now, he does go through and talk about the fact that, generally speaking, he said, let me just read this specifically. It says, if we look at quarterbacks whose PFF grade was 70 or under in the first half of the season, 70 or over in the second half of the season, and improve their PFF grade by at least 15 points over the two spans, it says there have been 20 quarterbacks since 2011. The amount of times that the second half of the season was predicted their PFF grade the following season was just 4 times. It says the first half of the season was even better at 9 times. The other 7 belonged to the full year PFF grade. So first of all, I have several issues with this that I'd like to do it myself. Unfortunately, I can't say that I can't do it. It would take a very long time to be able to parse all this out. There's a lot of variables here that I don't think are being accounted for. Number one, the biggest issue with PFF very easily is that you've got a guy, let's say he had a 65 PFF grade the second half of the season. He had an 80 the second half of the season because he had 2 games that were 90s. Otherwise, he sucked. That's a very different situation. Secondly, he's not accounting for all the other stable metrics that he talked about. How many of the other quarterbacks hit, not just an improvement, but one of the best quarterbacks in the entire NFL the second half of the season? He also did say at the beginning of this that it's less predictive when you look at younger quarterbacks. Now, he mentions Jordan Love isn't necessarily young, but that it is his first year, which means you can't just lump him in with a bunch of guys that have been doing this for 10 years. And that's kind of my point. You've got these guys that have generally always been kind of bad, and then they have this kind of second half flurry. Largely why? Because of a couple good games. Sometimes it's the postseason. Guys just snap. And in fact, Pat Mahomes is one of those. I don't know that he fully fits into that category, but if you look at him just in the regular season, he was outside of the top 10. If you look at the entire season, including the postseason, he was like the second or third highest graded quarterback because of how insane he went in the postseason. And you know, the bigger issue that I have with this is we're talking about a sample size of 20. And then, you know, you take those 20 and you apply all the other issues that I have with it. I don't care necessarily. Well, no, take the 20, eliminate everybody that doesn't apply in terms of what I just said. They didn't just have 1 or 2 games like at a 90 to overinflate the second half. We're talking about a first half in which they didn't know how to play football, a second half in which they did. And by the way, as you pointed out, and as many people have pointed out, you can very clearly see the process. He learned to play the position better. Is that the case with these other 20, or are we just talking about some random fluky nonsense? A couple examples he gives are Baker Mayfield, which is kind of weird because he says Baker Mayfield in 2020, and it is somewhat similar. He, in the first, let's say, 8-ish weeks, because he didn't play week 9, he was mostly good, but he had a couple bad games, and then the second half of the season, he was good almost every game and had 1, 2, 3, 4. It was probably pretty somewhat similar to Jordan's, with the exception of he didn't have 1, 2, like 3 70s and a 90 in the first half of the season. The issue that I have with it, though, is that he talks about seeing it and it didn't pan out because the next season he had a 63 grade. 2020 wasn't a fluke. 2018, 19, and 20, he was a very good quarterback. He graded out about as high over 3 seasons. The fluke wasn't 2020. The fluke was 2021 and then 2022 when he really fell off. This is what I don't get about the Baker Mayfield thing. Everyone's like, oh, this guy's a bust. He's garbage. He's terrible. And then when he played well in Tampa, it's like, what is this all about? Bro, he was a top 10 quarterback for like 3 years straight. What are we talking about here? He had 1 bad year in Cleveland. He got shipped off. He completely tanked and was better in Tampa Bay. I mean, if the comp is Baker Mayfield's kind of good. The fact that a fluky down year preceded that is kind of silly. Then he talks about Jameis Winston in 2018. I don't have no idea what he's talking about. I'm guessing he just kind of lumped these things together and didn't actually look at them. Baker Mayfield's tumultuous 2020 followed the same pattern, as did Jameis Winston's 2018. Jameis Winston had a 70 PFF grade. He's never had a good season. I refuse to believe that his... I got to look at the actual grades because there's no way. Let's see. So the first 9 weeks, Jameis was... he had a 61 PFF grade. Then it was 73.4. So, I mean, it's right at 74, so I guess that counts. Let me explain to you what Jameis Winston's 2018 season was. He was garbage basically the whole season. And he didn't play the first half of the season. He played weeks 4, 6, 7, and 8. That's it in the first half. And 2 of those games he actually graded out well. The problem is he had a 52 in week 4 and a 32 in week 8. Then the second half, he was just as bad, but he had an 80 against San Francisco, a 72 against Carolina, and an 88 against Atlanta. Other than that, it was a 60, 60, 40, 50. This is a terrible... This is one of those things, if you actually look at it, you got to throw it out. This is in no way comparable to what we saw with Jordan Love. And again, by 2018, this is his 4th year into the season. And guess what? He produced just like he always had. And the next year, what happened? Was it predictive of the early season or the late season? It was the exact same season. He had a 69 grade in 2018, a 68 grade in 2019. And he talks about Nick Foles on his Super Bowl run. This is exactly what I'm talking about. First of all, he didn't play the first half of the season. He didn't have one. He played week 9, and then he was, from week 12 on, it was 50, 60, 70. Then it was 30, 34, and 50. And then in the Super Bowl run, Nick Foles went insane. He had a 94 PFF grade, and then in the Super Bowl, a 92.3. Again, throw it out. Doesn't compare in any way whatsoever. I mean, the idea that anybody saw him play like that and thought, oh man, guess what? In 2018, he's going to be playing in the 90s every single week. What are you even talking about? He talks about Case Keenum here. Interestingly enough, I think I have this one pulled up as something to take a look at later, because he had a flukish game or season with the Minnesota Vikings. This one might be the most similar to Jordan Love, and we could possibly take a look at it. But he had a random season. So 2013, 14, 15, 16 happened. He's played for 2 teams already. His highest grade was a 69.7. The others were in the 50s, I think. Then he goes to Minnesota and has an 81 grade, and then it goes down to a 70, and then he just plummets into being terrible. So this might be one semi-legitimate example. The only issue that I kind of have with it, and I wish you could see what I'm saying, is it's really not, like there isn't this clear distinction between the first half of the season and the second half of the season. It's almost the opposite of like having 90s. The problem is he had a 3-game stretch where he was really bad, weeks 5, 6, and 7 in the beginning of the year. Outside of that, this whole season is pretty much the same. He had an 88 PFF grade week 3 against Tampa. He had a 70 the next week against Detroit. He had a 76 week 8. Like he played well. He just had a rough stretch. Plus, he missed a bunch of time in the beginning of the season. So we've got injuries that kind of obviously drew him down. And there's less games. So when you have 3 bad games mixed in with less games, it's going to have a higher impact. But then he goes on to have a good season. Not as good as Jordan did. He had 1 game in the 80s in week 14, and that was it, but a lot of 70s. So it's still not exactly the same. Talks about Phillip Rivers in 2011. Phillip Rivers was a very good quarterback. You mentioned it twice, so to say it doesn't repeat is silly. Ben Roethlisberger in 2016, very good quarterback. Sam Bradford in 2015, which again is a sort of silly example because it's mostly a consistent season. He had 2 bad games, weeks 2 and 3. That pulled down the first half. But again, his grades were consistent since 2012. It was 70, 72, 75, and then 76, which is even the next year. He's talking about how it's not the same the next year. He had a 76 grade in 2015 and a 77 in 2016. Talks about Teddy Bridgewater, the exact same thing. Weeks 16 and 17, he had an 86 and a 90, which inflated the second half. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these examples, but it seems to be about the same. But he says, given that Love's playstyle is extremely boom or bust, even the second half of the season, it would be hardly surprising to see him fall back down to earth. Back down to what, though? The first half of the season when he didn't know what he was doing? Why would he go back to that? If your whole thing is he was boom or bust the second half of the season as well, then why wouldn't he just be able to continue doing that? He had bad games in the second half of the season. He made mistakes. We saw several games where he made a mistake, but it's still the second half of the season. And come back down to what? I don't know what you even mean. Jordan Love, at the end of the season, had a PFF grade of 83.6. If he plays terribly for a half a season and still was able to put up an 83.6, what do you think he's going to fall back down to? I mean, I still don't understand what you're saying is going to happen. You're just saying the second half is going to go away and he's going to be like he was in the first half for most of the season? Even though you've already acknowledged that he went through a process change that drove this? Again, if you just take the second half and acknowledge that it was rough, right? I mean, week 9 was his first really good game. Week 10 was not as good. Week 11, he was down to a 65 grade. It wasn't great. Then he had Detroit and Kansas City, which was great. Then the Giants and Tampa, he was kind of bad. Then he was good against Carolina, Minnesota, Chicago, Dallas, and he played like crap against San Francisco. That's a boomer bust quarterback that still needs some work to do. But guess what? The good is still there too. It sounds to me like what he's saying is he's not going to be as good as last year, which to me would be difficult Because even if you say he's not going to have as many elite games, and he had a lot, 83 against LA, 87 against Detroit, 92 against Kansas City, 91 against Minnesota, 83 against Chicago, 93 against Dallas, which, by the way, in all these examples, you can't find one that did what Jordan Love did. Not one. You'd be hard-pressed to find quarterbacks that have had that many 80 or 90 games in that small of a stretch of football play ever. I'm talking Aaron Rodgers, Tom Brady, find anybody that's done it. I think we've actually gone back and tried. I think maybe Tom Brady had a season like that or something. I don't know. So your Case Keenum examples, because they had 190 grade, like, give me a freaking break here. But again, the larger point I have here is, so you want to tamp down all the good, but not bring up the first half. Like, let's replay the season with new Jordan Love, and we have to tamp down all the really, really goods. Okay, what do we do with the first half? Can we improve all of that? Because I still think it balances out to about an 85, right? You turn all those 60s into 70s and 50s into 60s and then bring the 90s to 80s and 80s to 70s. Hate to tell you, bud, I think that might even be a better season. Certainly is going to equate to a better record because he's not going to tank 8 entire weeks in the first half. That's the problem you still have to deal with. Even if you want to say the second half is not going to translate, fine. What was his grade starting in week 9? It's a 91. So if you want to say it's not going to be a 90, that's fine. I'm not going to say he's going to be a 91 quarterback every year. Nobody is. But what I think is reasonable to assume is that you could balance it out and say he's not going to continue what he did the second half of the season for entire seasons every year. Duh. But he's also not going to tank 8 games to start every season either. So fall back down to earth might mean tamp down the second half, but raise up the first half, which brings us right to where we are, meaning he's not going to regress. I'm very sorry to tell you, because I think that's what's missing here. What's missing in this whole thing is he says he's going to, the second half is not going to replicate. The second half was a 91. I agree he's not going to replicate that success, but he's going to come back down to earth. Come back down to earth probably still means in the 80s, though. Because, I mean, you got to understand, even in the examples he gave, I talked about it, they still had the same grade from year to year. They'd have a 75 this year and a 76 the next year. But his entire point is, yeah, but he didn't replicate what he did the second half of the season. He didn't continue that. That's fine. Who gives a crap? You're telling me Jordan Love, sorry to tell you guys, he's not going to have a 91 PFF grade. Okay, what's he going to do? Well, he'll have like an 84. Oh, no. Really? That's all we're going to talk about here? And again, the other issue I had with this is it's constantly like, you know, flirting with like these negative things, but being like, but I don't know. It says Love had a phenomenal end of the season run, and it should scare the rest of the division. But how much anxiety that means exactly might have been overstated. So what are you saying here? What are we talking about? It sounds to me like the entire thing could be summed up in essentially saying, if you look at his entire season, he struggled in some metrics, which we know, and it's entirely because the first half he struggled. Then he goes into the first and second half, talks about the second half was really good, which we know. Then he says, yeah, well, according to data, which is unbelievably limited and marginal that we don't have enough of, and obviously even within that data, we should probably, if we're being serious, strip some of these out of here because they're terrible examples with extenuating circumstances, but we're not going to do that because we only have 20. We've learned that very rarely, and by rarely I mean it's happened a few times, meaning it's certainly possible and it does happen, very rarely do you have a guy take that second half success, meaning maybe he had a 75 grade, but in the second half it was a 90 grade. Very rarely does that translate to next year being like a 90 grade. More so, it's the first half, which is not as good translating than it is the second half. Otherwise, it's just kind of, the same or whatever. Which again, I want to remind everybody, when he says that Jordan Love is likely to regress, what he's very specifically saying is regress from 91, not saying regress from 84. He might be trying to allude to that, but if we're following his exact logic here, he's saying regress from the 91 grade. I have no interest in fighting you on that. Who has a 91 grade every year? Who do you look at and just like, yeah, if I had to like sum up their career, it's like a 91. Nobody. Anyways, why don't we take a break? I pulled up some examples myself of guys that, as I said, they had 80 PFF grades at any point ever that aren't really seen as, like he brought up some quarterbacks that, like Phillip Rivers and Ben Roethlisberger. I mean, it's kind of silly to even bring that up because it's like, well, here's an example of somebody that did it and it didn't carry over. Yeah, but you understand you're talking about like Hall of Fame quarterbacks, right? I mean, these guys were really good. So I don't think that's really going to hurt anybody's feelings over here. So excluding those guys, the Daniel Joneses, the Marcus Mariotas, the Teddy Bridgewaters, whoever those types of guys, if I saw them in the 80-plus category, I plucked them out and I said, is this an example that we can point to that might scare us away? And I want to compare that to Jordan Love. We'll take a break. We'll be right back. We all have smartphones, and we all know they're pretty amazing, but they also can be amazingly distracting, especially when we're around other people. So US Cellular wants us to reset our relationship with our phones by putting down our phones for $5. That's right, a company that sells phones wants us to put down our phones. And to see what we find, learn more at uscellular.com/built-for-us.
We took it all. We brought them to our land. An endless night, ember hot and icy cold. The rage of the earth. We made this curse. Carved it in the blood on our backs. We did not see. We could not, but she did. And in the end,
What will I become? Senua's Saga. Hellblade 2.
Play it now with Game Pass.
You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Lips and Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Lips and Ads. Go to lipsandads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com. You're a podcast listener, and this is a podcast ad. Reach great listeners like yourself with podcast advertising from Lips and Ads. Choose from hundreds of top podcasts offering host endorsements, or run a reproduced ad like this one across thousands of shows to reach your target audience with Lips and Ads. Go to lipsandads.com now. That's LIBSYN ads.com.
All right, so Andy Dalton actually popped up several times on this list, which maybe should exclude him. But it kind of points to the fact that, you get your 80 grade and then it goes back down to 70s. And then you get your 80 grade. So in 2015, which was his fifth year in, he had an 80 PFF grade. Then the next 2 years, it went down into the 70s. 2018, 82. And then it went back down into the high 60s. And then he had 2 years in the 80s, 2022 and 2023. He actually, for New Orleans and Carolina, although Carolina he didn't play much, he actually performed pretty well. He's always been a decent enough quarterback. I'm surprised. Well, he's played every year. I shouldn't say I'm surprised he doesn't play much because he does. But if we look at, 2022 is a bad example because he did replicate that the next year. If we go to 2018, it's stupid because he didn't play hardly at all. And he had 3 games basically in the 90s and sucked. So that's not what we saw with Jordan. And again, injured almost the entire season. 2015 was his other example. If we look at that, more or less the same thing. And it was front loaded. He had like 5 weeks of being real good. It was 84, 67, 83, 91, 77. And he was pretty bad the rest of the season. I don't think that necessarily translates to what we saw with Jordan Love. Jacoby Brissett. Jacoby Brissett's actually really interesting. I kind of wrote him off because he was so bad for so long. He's been pretty solid the last 4 years. Granted, he hasn't played a ton, but Indy with his 11 snaps had a 74. That was his first, it was year 5. It was his first time performing well. Miami the next year, he played 260 snaps at a 76 grade. Cleveland, 416, 82 grade. And then Washington, only 25 snaps, but an 84.6 grade. So he's actually performed well for about 4 years now. But very, very fleeting and fluky. If you look at 2022 when he played his most snaps and played well, most of his grades are 50s and 60s with a 40 mixed in, but 83, 92, 91, and 90, which, I mean, that's a lot of really good games, but that's not what we saw from Jordan. It wasn't like garbage, 83, 92, then 4 mediocre games, then 91, bad, 90, 70, 52. I mean, there were ups and downs, but not like that. I mean, this is mostly a bad quarterback that you can't count on from week to week. Beyond that, I mean, you're looking at 12 touchdowns, 6 interceptions. Jordan Love was 37-13, and that's for the entire season, not even looking at the second half. Jacoby doesn't have a half. It's just that's the other thing, too, was the entire season of just ups and downs. His big-time throw percentage was less. His interception percentage was higher. Mac Jones, he had his one good year. I mean, this is the one that I think scares everybody, but Mac Jones was the exact opposite. I mean, this actually speaks negatively to the article because Mac Jones was kind of on fire the first half of the year, and by on fire is mostly just like a stretch of about 5 games. The second year, though, he was complete dog crap, and then after that, he started to fall off. Kyler Murray did it for 2 years, 2020 and 2021. If you look at him in 2020, he was basically just 70s every single week. So he was just solid every single week, and then he did it the next year, and he's had injury issues. Ryan Tannehill, I mean, it's kind of an unusual thing, but not really. I mean, he's been a good quarterback, and then since going to Tennessee has just been kind of elite. So if this is sort of your comp, then I guess I'm okay with it, but he's had way too many bad games, way too sporadic. Derek Carr's about the same. I mean, again, if you take him in 2016 with his 85 grade, I mean, the year before that was a 76. He's been about the 70s with a couple 80s mixed in. I mean, it would suck if Jordan Love became that, but if that's what we're talking about, okay. Ryan Fitzpatrick in 2018, he was injured almost the entire year. He was terrible, but his first 2 weeks, he had a 96 and a 96. So, no, that's not the same thing. Case Keenum had a fluky year. We already talked about that. That's maybe the most similar. I'm going to save that, and we can kind of look at that a little bit. Alex Smith in 2017, but he was kind of flirting with that to begin with, and it was only an 82 for the season. He was 70s pretty much every year. But even that, it was like 4 really good games and just 40s and 50s, and you don't see that from Jordan. So that's not a great comp. Carson Wentz did it in 2017. It was mostly just on the back of all 70s, very consistent, very different from what we've seen. Jimmy Garoppolo did it when he played like 5 weeks, and all 5 of them were good. Cam Newton did it once in 2015. Kind of similar, actually, in a weird way. Save that one. Carson Palmer did it in 2015. He was just a man on a mission that year. I mean, from day one, he was tearing everything up. Again, though, and I understand this is a little unfair because we haven't seen much from Jordan, so we don't know. But, I mean, we've got like 10 years of history on Carson Wentz prior to this to know that this is probably not sustainable, right? I mean, it was 60, 60, 60, 70, 86. It's like, he's going to crash. You know, he might crash down to a 70, which he did, 73, and then 60 after that. But, I mean, look, if Carson Palmer was a rookie and put up these numbers, yes, I would assume that he would continue that and he's going to be an elite quarterback, and he would have fallen off, and that's unfortunate. Tony Romo, kind of a similar thing. He did it twice. 2010, he actually had a 92. 2014, he had an 83. Again, it was mostly... He had a 3-game stretch where it was 80s and 90s. He was pretty bad almost the entire season, just with sporadic 80s and 90s. He had a 96 against Indy. I mean, the bottom line is if Jordan Love had done this, I would have said the guy probably is not very good. I mean, these grades are terrible, but there's just elite games mixed in. That's not what you want. Again, with Jordan, you had all 60s and 50s, which isn't terrible, by the way. A lot of these guys, like with Cam Newton, there's 40s mixed in. Jordan didn't have any 40s. He had 150 prior to the game against San Francisco. Everything else was 60s, which, again, isn't great, but it's not terrible. Then it's 80, 70, 66, which is not terrible, 87, 92, then, there was a 50 here, 58, 66, 70, 90, 80, 90. I mean, the consistency of being good to great. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 games that were 70s, 80s, or 90s in 11. 8 out of 11, with 2 of the non-70s being high 60s and 158 game. You can't compare Jay Cutler to that because he had 190, 185, and another 90, which are beginning, middle, and end with a bunch of just in between. RG3. Not a good example for a couple reasons. Number 1, the grades were nowhere near Jordan Love. Number 2, he got worse as the season went on. And number 3, a lot of his problems came because he got injured. Eli Manning, kind of similar, a lot of sporadic nonsense mixed in. And he also had a 4-year stretch of being pretty solid with the Giants. Matt Schaub, kind of. His first 5 weeks were terrible, and then it was 80, 70, 80, 90, 70, 70, 70, 70, 65, 80, 80, basically. The problem is Matt Schaub was actually dominant. His grade in Atlanta was a 71. Then he goes to Houston. It's 80, 70, 80, 80, 78, 73. Before he started to fall off after that. It looks like injuries got a hold of him, but Matt Schaub was actually quite good. Same with Jeff Garcia. I have no idea what happened to Jeff Garcia, but in 2007, he had an 81 grade, largely because he had a flurry of 4 games that were really good. He played like crap the second half, but he had an 81 grade. The next year in Tampa, he had an 80 grade, and then he just never played again. So there you go. David Gerard barely got in with an 81 grade, largely just very consistent 70s and 80s, and then played like crap down the stretch. Josh McCown had one 86 grade on the back of just maybe the worst quarterback career I've ever seen, largely because he only played 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 games, and only 2 of them sucked. Sean Hill, Minnesota, similar thing. He only played about a half a season, and the second half was quite good. There was 190 mixed in. It inflated his grades. So let's real quick take a look at these 2 that I thought were semi-similar. Cam Newton in 2015, Case Keenum in 2017. One of the problems right off the bat with Case Keenum is that he actually graded out fairly well in the first half. He was ranked 16th, but had a 72 PFF grade. That did go up to an 85.5 in the second half. So, all right, let's look at the second half. He had 1,900 yards. He ranked 7th in touchdowns with 15. He had only 4 interceptions. He was ranked 6th via PFF grade, 6th in PFF passing grade, 4.5 big-time throw percentage, 2 turnover-worthy play percentage. Funny enough, these numbers are closer to Jordan Love for the season. Jordan Love, his big-time throw rate, which is absurd, 7.6% big-time throw percentage, which I know is not one of the stable metrics, but that's wild. But Jordan was 90 PFF grade, 91 passing grade, 20 touchdowns, 3 interceptions, 2,400 yards. And he ranked 4th, which the rank doesn't necessarily matter because it depends the other quarterbacks that you're up against. For example, Jordan Love would have been, let's see, with his 90, he would have been tied for 2nd with Matt Ryan, behind Ben Roethlisberger. So, I mean, can you kind of point to Case Keenum? Maybe a little bit. But again, my biggest issue is he actually just had a good season with 3 bad games mixed in. He never played the way Jordan played. His grades were basically 70, 60, 70, 70, 70, 80, 70, 60, 70, 60, 60. That does not compare to what Jordan did. Cam Newton's a little bit more similar. Again, he had better games, but he also had worse games. He was more volatile to start the season. 60, 60, 70, 40, 70, 50, 80, 60 is how he started the season. He had 7 games of 70s, 80s, or 90s, with just 4 that were below that, with 1 being in the 50s. So it is very similar to what you had with Jordan. There's only a couple things I would say. Number 1, more volatility. Number 2, you don't have a switch flip with Cam Newton. This was an entire season of playing well. He just had like 2 elite games, weeks 13 and 14. Otherwise, it was just very spotty, good game, bad game, good game, bad game. But I guess if you wanted to point to one example that is semi-similar to what Jordan did, that showed, it's hard to even call it growth, but like a really good second half of the season that just didn't pan out, right? He had an 80 overall grade, and he was just never really good after that. Cam Newton would probably be that guy. But again, contextually, obviously, there's some big differences here. Cam Newton, we had 1, 2, 3, 4 years prior to this of knowing what he is and what he isn't. Jordan Love, we saw him play, we saw the switch flip, and we saw what he became. This wasn't some heroic effort. This wasn't some guy who just dug down deep and found something in him that was on a warpath. This is not a guy who had elite players around him making plays, making him look better than he was. This wasn't like the Brett Favre game after his dad died where he's just launching mortars down the field, and these guys are going up and you know, they're willing to die for these balls. They're going to do everything for them. This was Jordan clearly playing at a higher level. We saw the throws that looked like Aaron Rodgers, and we saw the throws that looked like Brett Favre, the good and the bad. So, again, I will say that I don't know that Jordan Love is going to be an elite quarterback. I don't know what he's going to be. And I appreciate what Arif Hasan is trying to do, and I appreciate him putting some metrics behind this to try to quantify things, but The problem that I have is that none of it actually really applies. We're putting him in a box that he doesn't belong in, and it's a very small box of only 20 people. And again, if you eliminate all the factors that don't apply or shouldn't be included, you don't have really anything left of the 20. So I sympathize with essentially his conclusion, which is, and I struggle to make fun of him because I do it all the time. You spend a lot of time working on something only to come to the conclusion of, I don't know, right? I mean, Jordan was very good in the second half of the season. What does that mean? I don't know. Data suggests it doesn't mean anything, but Jordan's a little bit different. I mean, it was his first year, kind of, but also not really. It's hard to compare him to anybody because there's really nobody that's been in this situation. And even if you can find people that have, it's such a small sample size. You know, when you've got things like EPA, the reason EPA even matters is because when they say it's 3rd and 5 on the 25-yard line and da-da-da-da-da-da, and here's your what we expect of you. It's like, well, how can you say what to expect? It's like, because we have 10,000 data points of teams being in this exact situation. So yeah, we have expectations. To find maybe one guy, even so what? Cam isn't Jordan. Jordan isn't Cam. Jordan isn't Rodgers. He's not Favre. Again, I appreciate data, but we don't have enough of it. We don't have enough from Jordan. We don't have enough similar situations to be able to draw conclusions. We don't have anything here. All we have is really what we saw with our own eyes, which is a guy that became something pretty special in the second half of the season. And although it's possible that maybe he really just dug down deep and found that crazy thing and he's never going to get back there, I would say, this is my own, and you know that I would not say it if I didn't believe it. I would say it's much less likely that was fake and much more likely that was actually real. And what does that manifest into? Does that mean he's going to be a 75, an 85, a 95, consistently throughout his... I have no idea. I really don't know. But I'm pretty excited to find out because I think he's incredibly talented. I think everybody saw that he was incredibly talented. I know we can try to throw numbers at it to dismiss it if we want to, but I don't know that any of it's really going to stick very well. I'm open to being convinced. There's nothing here. You're going to throw 20 quarterbacks at me that shouldn't even be on this list? That's not a big enough sample size for me to give a crap about. If you had 200, okay. If you had 200 and a way to filter it, maybe bring it down to 100 real solid examples, sure, it might be worth it. Although, again, not really, because even still, of that 100, you're going to have, 10 that did go on to be that, and then we're sitting here going, okay, so what does that mean for Jordan? Nothing, because we don't know what Jordan is. We don't know which one he falls into. I also know that we're off to a good start this year already. It's only been one OTA that's been open to camp, but I know that of all the OTAs and training camp practices that we had, I can tell you confidently there has never been one where Jordan didn't struggle at some point. And to hear that he went, 7 of 7? It might sound minor and insignificant. I'm telling you, it's not. For Jordan to come in and just be that dude and just shred the defense and just say this crap is easy, he didn't do that one time last year. Just saying. By the way, more OTAs this week, starting, today for you, tomorrow for me. So I don't know what's going to be open. It looks like we got OTAs Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday this week. So I don't know if we get one more day of access or 0 or 2 or whatever, but anytime we get some information, obviously that's what we'll be talking about that next day, so hope for good things. I'm going to leave it at that. You guys have a good rest of your day. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.